Secretary Noem, back in July, the department put out a press release titled "Worst of the Worst." Criminal proceedings begin in a case of transgender illegal alien accused of rape, child rape, not just rape, child rape of a 14-year-old boy in a sanctuary New York City bathroom. I wanted to highlight this case because it encapsulates so many different violent policies of Democrats. This is an increase in trans violence with their embrace of gender ideology, an egregious catch and release policy implemented under the last 4 years, and sanctuary cities that harbor criminal, illegal alien monsters that have raped and murdered many Americans. Can you discuss further what you're facing in these sanctuary cities and the illegal?
You're watching the raw weaponization of human suffering in real time, and what you just witnessed in that clip is not mere partisan squabbling or heated congressional discourse, but the calculated deployment of fear itself as a governing philosophy. Because when Marjorie Taylor Greene stands before that hearing and invokes the specter of a single horrific alleged crime to paint millions of human beings as monsters, she is executing the oldest playbook in the fascist handbook. And I need you to understand, this isn't hyperbole. This is the mechanism by which autocratic movements have always consolidated power by taking the most visceral human fears about safety and children and sexual violence and then alchemizing them into justification for mass cruelty. And you need to grasp what's happening here, because Trump told a rally audience in September 2024 that the deportation effort will be a bloody story, and Greene is providing the narrative infrastructure for that bloodshed right now in this moment before your eyes. Let's dissect the architecture of this dehumanization, because it's brilliant in its spazzing evil precision, and it begins with that phrase, illegal alien monsters, repeated twice for emphasis, as though the repetition itself can cement the ontological transformation of human beings into creatures beyond moral consideration. And this is the linguistic prelude to genocide. I'm not being dramatic here. When you systematically strip people of their humanity through language, when you classify entire populations as monstrous, you are laying the groundwork for atrocities that populations will accept because the victims have already been discursively removed from the category of persons, deserving empathy or rights. And notice how she scaffolds this dehumanization by linking it to the most inflammatory possible combination of contemporary moral panics, the intersection of immigration status with transgender identity with child sexual abuse, creating this perfect storm of right-wing rage triggers that short-circuits any possibility of rational analysis. Because once you've activated those neural pathways of disgust and fear, the critical thinking centers of the brain literally shut down. This is neuropolitics deployed with surgical cruelty. But here's what makes this moment so explosively dangerous, and why you need to pay attention right now today in December 2024, because Trump has begun to shift American immigration policy in his first few days in office, vowing to clamp down on immigration and undo Biden-era policies, signing executive orders that would give ICE greater ability to conduct enforcement actions in sensitive areas, expand the pool of undocumented immigrants subject to fast-track deportation, and attempt to end birthright citizenship. And Greene's rhetoric here is manufacturing consent for what the New York Times reported as Trump's plan for an extreme expansion of his first-term crackdown on immigration, including preparing to round up undocumented people already in the United States on a vast scale and detain them in sprawling camps. And when I tell you this is fascism, I mean this with the precision of someone who has studied the historical record, because the detention camp infrastructure being proposed right now echoes every authoritarian regime's pivot from demonization to elimination. Now let's talk about what Greene is actually doing with her so-called question, because this isn't oversight. This isn't legitimate congressional inquiry. This is performative cruelty designed for viral distribution and political fundraising, and the genius of it, from her perspective, is that she's taking a single alleged crime, individual case that should be handled by the criminal justice system, and she's using it as a cynic de toe for an entire population, transmuting one accused person into millions of monsters. And this is statistically and intellectually bankrupt, because research found that undocumented immigrants were 37.1% less likely to be convicted of a crime, and that there is no correlation between undocumented people and a rise in crime. And 2020, immigrants were 60% less likely to be incarcerated than the US-born, as the immigrant share of the population grew to 13.9%. By 2022, the total crime rate had dropped by 60.4%, with the violent crime rate falling by 34.5%. So when Greene stands there invoking criminal illegal alien monsters, she is literally inverting empirical reality. She is constructing a fantasy world where immigrants represent a crime wave, when every single piece of evidence demonstrates the exact opposite. And you want to know what's really happening here beneath the inflammatory rhetoric, because Greene isn't stupid. She knows the statistics, she knows that research provides evidence that unauthorized immigration is generally negatively associated with violent crime, and seriously undermines claims that violent crime has increased as a result of undocumented immigration. But facts are irrelevant when you're engaged in what political theorists call stochastic terrorism, the use of mass communication to incite random acts of violence that are statistically predictable but individually unpredictable. And when she brands an entire population as monsters, she is sending a signal to every right-wing vigilante, every ICE agent, every local police officer that these people are legitimate targets, that violence against them is not just acceptable, but morally necessary. And we've already seen this play out, haven't we, in the mass shootings in El Paso and Pittsburgh and Buffalo, where white supremacist terrorists explicitly cited replacement theory, rhetoric that sounds exactly like what Greene is saying right now. Let's examine the sanctuary city component of her attack, because this is where the constitutional vandalism becomes most apparent, and New York's sanctuary city policies are in compliance with federal law, because the Supreme Court has clarified that immigration enforcement is the sole duty of the federal government, and federal law does not require local law enforcement to collect information on immigration or citizenship status. Yet Greene frames these legally compliant policies as somehow harboring criminals, when in fact, sanctuary policies allow immigrants to report abuses and engage with public safety officials without fear of deportation, and on average 35.5 fewer crimes are committed per 10,000 people in counties with sanctuary policies. So sanctuary cities are objectively safer, but Greene needs you to believe the opposite, because the entire infrastructure of mass deportation that Trump is constructing requires local cooperation, and sanctuary cities represent jurisdictions that have said we will not be complicit in your human rights violations, and that's what this is really about. Greene is trying to bully and shame and legally threaten cities into abandoning their constitutionally protected right to allocate their own resources as they see fit. Attorney General Pamela Bondi has declared that sanctuary policies impede law enforcement and put American citizens at risk by design, and that the Department of Justice will continue bringing litigation against sanctuary jurisdictions. And this legal warfare against cities that refuse to participate in Trump's deportation apparatus represents a fundamental assault on federalism itself, because the 10th Amendment, which conservatives claim to revere when it suits them, exists precisely to prevent the federal government from commandeering state and local resources for federal priorities, and neither the Constitution nor any federal statute prohibits policies that limit cooperation with federal immigration enforcement. Yet here we are watching the weaponization of the Department of Justice against jurisdictions whose only crime is choosing not to use their police officers as immigration agents. But the most insidious element of Greene's performance is the way she weaves together transgender identity with immigration status with criminality, creating this toxic intersectional panic that serves multiple reactionary purposes simultaneously, because she's not just demonizing immigrants, she's also advancing the broader right-wing assault on transgender existence by implying that trans identity itself inherently predatory and violent. And this is the same moral panic playbook that's been used to justify bathroom bills and healthcare bans and the erasure of trans people from public life, and by linking it to immigration, she's suggesting that both transgender people and immigrants represent existential threats to children, to white children specifically, because that's always the subtext here. The protection of white innocence from the contaminating presence of racialized others and gender deviance, and this is how fascism operates, through the construction of overlapping categories of supposedly threatening outsiders who must be expelled or eliminated to restore the mythical purity of the nation. And while we're deconstructing this, we need to talk about the catch and release framing, because this is animal control language deliberately chosen to strip migrants of humanity. Catch stray dogs, you catch pests, you catch vermin. You don't catch human beings fleeing persecution and poverty and climate catastrophe and violence. But Greene deploys this terminology because it activates that framework of immigrants as infestation, as something less than human that needs to be trapped and removed. And this connects to Trump's own rhetoric, where he said, "They're not humans, they're not humans, they're animals," and claimed Nancy Pelosi told him not to use the word animals. But he insisted, "I'll use the word animal because that's what they are." And this is not political incorrectness. This is not telling it like it is. This is the deliberate construction of a category of subhuman beings against whom any violence becomes justifiable. Now I need you to understand the temporal stakes here, because we're not talking about hypothetical future policies, we're watching the implementation in real time. The gloves are off, says Border Czar Tom Homan repeatedly, Since his appointment as ICE agents carry out routine enforcement operations with greater latitude, Trump's mass deportation plan could begin with the removal of hundreds of thousands of new arrivals admitted under Biden programs, including canceling humanitarian parole and changing deportation guidelines so ICE can arrest and put undocumented immigrants in deportation proceedings more freely. And this isn't fear-mongering, this is reporting on stated policy intentions, and the American Immigration Council estimated the cost of conducting 1 million deportations at $967.9 billion in federal government spending over a decade, so we're talking about the largest mobilization of state violence against a civilian population in American history funded by tax dollars that could rebuild our infrastructure, educate our children, provide universal health care, but instead will be used to tear families apart and traumatize entire communities. Let me hit you with another bombshell about the economic devastation this represents. Because immigrants aren't taking jobs, they're filling labor shortages in critical sectors. If fully implemented, the administration's deportation agenda may consign hundreds of thousands of migrants to poverty, oppression, and sometimes even death in their countries of origin, while gravely damaging the U.S. economy by deporting a large part of its labor force. And this is the cruel irony that Greene and Trump, and the entire nativist movement, refuse to acknowledge that the American economy is structurally dependent on immigrant labor, both documented and undocumented, and mass deportation would trigger economic collapse in agriculture, construction, hospitality, healthcare, all the sectors that keep this country functioning. But economic rationality has never been the point. The point is the cruelty. The point is the spectacle of state power deployed against the vulnerable. The point is giving the white nationalist base exactly what they want, which is the visible suffering of brown people. And we need to discuss the historical parallels here, because this isn't the first time America has pursued mass deportation, and Greene herself invokes this history when she references Trump's admiration for Eisenhower's immigration policies. Operation Wetback, as it was known in official government documents, took its name from a racist term for Mexicans who swam or waded across the Rio Grande, when in 1954 Eisenhower's immigration commissioner launched the military-style operation to remove thousands of Mexicans, and that operation was characterized by constitutional violations, civil rights abuses, death, and displacement, and Trump and his allies look at that as a model to be emulated, not a mistake to be avoided, and this tells you everything you need to know about the moral framework governing this movement. But here's where we get to the resistance strategies, because I refuse to end this on despair. Los Angeles approved a so-called sanctuary city ordinance aimed at protecting undocumented immigrants from potential deportation, and the city has voted to approve a sanctuary city ordinance that would protect immigrants living in LA in response to Trump's promise to start mass deportations when local law enforcement agencies are not involved in deportations. Immigrant communities are better integrated, more secure, and more involved, while their children are less likely to live in fear of losing a parent. So sanctuary policies aren't just morally right, they're pragmatically effective at building safer, stronger communities, and that's why jurisdictions across the country are doubling down on them despite the federal threats. We also need to mobilize around the legal resistance because civil rights groups are prepared to challenge the use of the Alien Enemies Act, since we are not at war with countries that migrants primarily come from, and federal actions intended to force local jurisdictions to perform immigration enforcement are likely unconstitutional under the 10th Amendment, and there is a robust legal infrastructure prepared to challenge every aspect of Trump's deportation apparatus in the courts. And while we know this Supreme Court is hostile to immigrant rights, we also know that lower federal courts have previously blocked Trump's immigration overreach. There are still constitutional limits, even in this degraded moment, and progressives need to go on offense here, not just defense, because members of Congress who are pro-immigrant can use the appropriations process to effectively thwart Trump's ability to carry out mass detention and deportations, and should make a path to citizenship for millions of long-standing U.S. residents, a non-negotiable central demand in negotiations, while going on offense with their own package of solutions. And this is crucial because the immigration debate has been allowed to be framed entirely on right-wing terms around enforcement and borders and security, when what we should be talking about is justice and human rights, and the moral obligation to provide refuge to people fleeing impossible circumstances, and the economic and social benefits of immigration. Let me be absolutely clear about the stakes here, because when Greene uses one alleged crime to justify calling millions of people monsters, she is doing precisely what every ethnic cleansing campaign in history has done, creating a narrative of existential threat that justifies elimination. And we've seen this movie before, we know how it ends, and it ends with boxcars and detention camps and families separated and children in cages and mass graves. And I'm not exaggerating, there is a direct through line from dehumanizing rhetoric to bureaucratic implementation to mass atrocity, and we are watching the early stages right now in December 2024, and the only question is whether we have the collective will to stop it before we reach the point of no return. The progressive response must be uncompromising moral clarity, because immigrants have always been a core part of the American story, and families looking for a better life help make our country and our economy vibrant and strong. And we know that tearing families apart, caging children, and turning our backs on refugees seeking safety isn't making us stronger, and we need to join together to create fair immigration laws that treat each person with dignity. And this isn't naivete. This is a recognition that the alternative to justice-centered immigration policy is barbarism, is the descent into a police state organized around the hunting and caging of human beings, and no society that goes down that path emerges with its soul intact. So when you watch that clip of Marjorie Taylor Greene calling human beings monsters, when you see her leveraging a single alleged crime to condemn entire populations, when you witness her building the discursive foundation for mass deportation and detention, I need you to recognize it for what it is, which is the face of American fascism in 2024, and it's not coming, it's here, it's speaking into microphones in congressional hearings, it's signing executive orders, it's building detention infrastructure, it's coming for the most vulnerable people first, as fascism always does, but it never stops with the first targets because the logic of purification is insatiable, and eventually it comes for everyone who doesn't fit the ever-narrowing definition of belonging, and the only way to stop it is to fight back at every level, legal, political, social, cultural, to defend the sanctuary cities, to flood the immigration courts, with pro bono attorneys to document every abuse, to tell the stories of the human beings being targeted, to make this mass cruelty visible and unbearable to the conscience of the nation. Because that's what Greene is banking on, that will look away, that will accept the dehumanization, that will let the machinery of deportation grind forward unopposed, and we cannot, we must not, we will not, because the arc of history doesn't bend toward justice on its own. It bends because people grab it and pull with everything they have, and right now we need to pull harder than ever before. Our collective future depends on it.